Quiet settled over the house the moment the nanny spoke. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against the ears and makes every breath sound too loud. And he froze on the staircase with one hand still resting on the cool wooden railing, his foot hovering mid-step, as if moving even an inch might shatter something fragile. Quiet. Listen, your fiancé is talking on the phone, the nanny had said, her voice low and cautious, not excited, not curious, but weighted with concern, and in that instant he knew this wasn't harmless chatter. He hadn't planned to eavesdrop. He had come home early because a meeting was canceled, carrying the pleasant surprise of free time and thoughts of wedding details, menus, guest lists, silly arguments about music. The house looked the same as always, sunlight spilling across the floor, the faint smell of flowers she loved lingering in the air, but something underneath it all felt wrong, like a familiar song suddenly played in the wrong key. He leaned slightly toward the half-open living room door, his heart beginning to beat faster as her voice drifted out, stripped of the warmth and laughter she usually reserved for him. It was quieter, sharper, edged with tension. "No, you don't understand," she said, each word measured, almost rehearsed. "I can't tell him yet." His chest tightened at the word him, because there was no doubt who she meant. The nanny shifted behind him, clearly uncomfortable, clearly wishing she had never noticed anything at all, but it was too late now. The moment had already taken root. He stayed still, barely breathing, listening as if his life depended on it, fragments falling into place without forming a complete picture. "It would ruin everything," she continued, and that sentence hit harder than he expected, because everything to him meant their shared mornings, the plans pinned to the fridge, the future he thought was solid and agreed upon. His mind raced through possibilities. Was there someone else, a secret from the past, a mistake she hadn't confessed? Before he could settle on one fear, her voice trembled, and that tremble confused him more than anger would have. "I did what I had to do," she said softly, almost defensively. "You promised you'd leave me alone." Silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of the house and the distant reply from the phone he couldn't hear. And in that silence a strange cold crept up his spine, the realization that whatever this was, it had been carried quietly for some time. He remembered how she sometimes went silent at night, staring at nothing, how she brushed off his questions with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, how love can coexist with fear without announcing itself. His instinct screamed at him to step forward, to open the door, to demand answers immediately, but his body refused to move, held in place by the weight of uncertainty and the fear of what the truth might cost. The nanny's presence grounded him in an odd way. This wasn't a dramatic confrontation in a movie, just three people trapped in a moment they hadn't chosen. He wondered what the nanny must have thought, hearing those words while simply doing her job, and whether she had struggled with the choice to warn him at all. His thoughts drifted to his mother, long gone, who used to say that secrets don't shout, they whisper, and only those who slowed down enough ever hear them. Another sigh came from the room, heavier this time, almost breaking into a sob. "Just give me time." His fiancée pleaded into the phone, and that single request pierced him with unexpected sadness rather than rage. Time for what? To explain, to fix, to escape? The call ended abruptly, the click echoing louder than it should have, and footsteps approached the door. Panic jolted through him, and he stepped back instinctively, forcing his face into something that resembled calm, though his pulse thundered in his ears. When she appeared moments later, her smile arrived a fraction too late, her eyes searching his face before settling into familiarity. "You're home early," she said lightly, leaning in to kiss his cheek, and he responded on instinct, returning the gesture, even as doubt lingered like a bitter aftertaste. He said nothing, asked nothing, and hated himself a little for the relief he felt at delaying the truth. The nanny quietly retreated, her role in the moment complete, leaving him alone with questions that refused to stay quiet. That night, lying beside the woman he was supposed to marry, he stared at the ceiling while she slept, her breathing steady and unaware, replaying every word he had heard, every pause, every hidden meaning, realizing that love, real love, isn't tested when everything is perfect, but in moments like this, when listening changes you and there is no easy way back. Morning arrived with the illusion of normalcy, sunlight slipping through the curtains and settling gently across the bed. And for a few brief seconds he almost believed the night before had been a dream. But then he heard her moving beside him, felt the familiar shift of the mattress, and the memory of her voice on the phone returned with sharp clarity. She smiled at him when she noticed he was awake, warm and casual, asking if he wanted coffee, and he answered yes even though his throat felt tight, because pretending was suddenly easier than risking the truth. In the kitchen she moved with the same graceful efficiency he loved, humming softly, setting 2 cups on the counter as if nothing in the world was out of place, and he watched her closely, searching for cracks, for guilt, for fear, but all he saw was the woman he thought he knew. The nanny passed through the room quietly, offering a polite greeting, her eyes meeting his for just a moment, and in that glance he saw confirmation that the previous evening had been real. He left for work soon after, kissing his fiancée goodbye, telling her he'd be late, and the moment the door closed behind him the weight he'd been carrying pressed down harder. The drive to the office blurred past him, traffic lights changing without meaning, his mind replaying fragments of the call again and again, filling in gaps with imagined explanations that shifted from minute to minute. At his desk, emails went unanswered, meetings passed in a haze, and every time his phone vibrated his chest tightened, half expecting some unknown number to appear, proof that the secret was already reaching out to him. By midday, patience gave way to determination, not the explosive kind fueled by anger, but a quiet resolve rooted in the understanding that whatever was hidden between them would only grow heavier if left untouched. He decided he would not accuse or spy. He would create a moment where the truth could exist without fear. When he returned home earlier than expected, he announced himself loudly, forcing cheer into his voice, and found her in the living room surrounded by wedding magazines, color samples spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle. She looked up, surprised but pleased, and launched into excited talk about centerpieces and seating arrangements. And he listened, nodding, marveling at how easily a person could plan a future while carrying a secret past. He suggested they go for a walk, said the air felt too heavy indoors, and she agreed without hesitation, slipping her arm through his as they stepped outside. The neighborhood park was quiet, the late afternoon sun filtering through the trees, leaves crunching beneath their feet in a steady rhythm that gave him courage. They walked in silence for a while, and with every step his thoughts arranged themselves into careful words, because he knew once spoken, they could not be taken back. He stopped near a bench, turned to face her, and spoke gently about trust, about how marriage wasn't just a celebration or a promise of happiness, but a commitment to face uncomfortable truths together. He told her he felt something stood between them, something unspoken, and that it frightened him not because he expected perfection, but because he believed honesty was the only way forward. Her body stiffened almost imperceptibly, her eyes flickering with alarm before she masked it with confusion. "Why are you saying this?" she asked, her voice light but strained, and in that moment he saw the fear she had hidden so well. He took a breath and admitted he had overheard part of her phone call the night before, not the details, only enough to know that she was carrying something alone. Silence settled between them, heavier than the quiet in the house had been, and for a long moment she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the path ahead as if searching for escape. Then her shoulders sagged, and the fight drained out of her, replaced by exhaustion. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered that she had planned to tell him, that she just needed time, and hearing his own words reflected back to him sent a strange ache through his chest. She began to speak in broken pieces, explaining that before they met, she had taken on a debt to help a relative in crisis, that the man who provided the money had demanded secrecy, using her fear as leverage, and that every reminder call felt like a threat hanging over her happiness. She confessed that she hadn't been unfaithful, but she had been ashamed, terrified that he would see her as damaged or irresponsible, and so she chose silence, believing she was protecting him. As she spoke, tears fell freely, and he felt his anger dissolve into a complicated mix of hurt and understanding, because the betrayal wasn't in the debt itself, but in the wall it had built between them. He asked why she hadn't trusted him, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest, and she admitted that loving him made the risk feel greater, not smaller, because losing him was unthinkable. They sat on the bench as the sun dipped lower, talking through the details, the numbers, the fear, and with every honest word spoken aloud, the burden seemed to shrink. He didn't promise easy solutions or instant forgiveness, but he promised presence, and in that moment she leaned into him. And for the first time since the nanny's warning, the silence between them felt less like a threat and more like a space where healing could begin. The days that followed were nothing like the simple, predictable rhythm they had known before, because once a truth is spoken aloud, it changes the shape of everything around it. And both of them felt that shift immediately. Conversations became slower and more deliberate, filled with pauses where they measured words instead of letting them spill freely. And yet there was an honesty in those pauses that hadn't existed before. He found himself waking early, staring at the ceiling while the house slept, thinking not only about her secret, but about his own. How easily he had assumed certainty, how rarely he had considered the weight others carry silently. She, too, seemed altered, moving with a cautious openness, as if unsure whether relief or fear would dominate now that the wall she'd built was coming down. They talked at night after the nanny had put the child to bed, sitting at the kitchen table with untouched cups of tea growing cold between them, mapping out the situation piece by piece. She explained more fully how the debt had grown, how each promise of just a little more time had tightened the man's grip, and how she had convinced herself that handling it alone was the only way to keep their future intact. Listening to her, he felt a strange blend of protectiveness and frustration, not at her weakness, but at the belief that love required isolation. He suggested practical steps, documents, timelines, boundaries, and for the first time she didn't resist, her nodding head signaling trust rather than fear. When they decided to confront the man together, the choice felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping into deep water knowing there was no solid ground behind them anymore. The meeting took place in a neutral office, cold and impersonal, and as they sat side by side, he noticed how tightly she held her hands together, knuckles pale, and he reached for her without thinking, anchoring both of them. The man spoke with practiced confidence, trying to assert control through tone and implication, but something had changed. The secret no longer belonged to him alone. He responded calmly, firmly, making it clear that manipulation would not continue, that legal channels were now involved, and that any further pressure would have consequences. Watching the exchange, she felt a surge of emotion that surprised her, not just gratitude, but a quiet grief for the months she had spent believing she was alone. When they left the building, the air felt lighter, though the problem wasn't fully solved, and she exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for years. The weeks that followed were filled with practical challenges, meetings with lawyers, financial adjustments, uncomfortable calls, and there were moments when exhaustion and doubt resurfaced, threatening to reopen old wounds. He had nights where resentment crept in uninvited, wondering why she hadn't trusted him sooner, and she sensed it, apologizing more than necessary, afraid that forgiveness was fragile. They learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to speak about those feelings without letting them turn into weapons, how to acknowledge pain without assigning blame. The nanny watched this transformation quietly, noticing how the atmosphere of the house shifted from tense politeness to something more real. And though she never spoke of that first warning again, her presence carried a gentle approval, as if she knew the hardest part had already been done. One evening, after a particularly long day, they found themselves laughing unexpectedly over something trivial, and the sound startled them both, because it felt like a reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. He realized then that trust wasn't a single decision, but a series of choices made again and again, especially when it would be easier to withdraw. She realized that strength didn't come from enduring alone, but from allowing herself to be seen in her most vulnerable moments. As the legal matters moved toward resolution and the man's influence faded into the background, a different kind of challenge emerged, learning how to live without the constant pressure that had shaped her decisions for so long. She struggled with guilt, with the fear that calm was temporary, and he learned to recognize those moments, offering reassurance not as a fix, but as companionship. They revisited their wedding plans, not with blind excitement, but with thoughtful intention, discussing what marriage truly meant to them now, stripped of fantasy. It meant accountability, patience, and the courage to listen even when the truth felt uncomfortable. Some nights, Lying together in the quiet, he thought back to the moment on the stairs, to the nanny's hushed voice and the fear that had followed, and he understood that without that interruption, the secret might have continued to grow, silently poisoning what they loved. The experience had marked them both, leaving scars that were still tender, but it had also deepened their bond in a way that no perfect romance ever could, teaching them that love tested by truth, though painful, has a chance to become something stronger and more enduring than love protected by silence. The final weeks before the wedding unfolded with a quiet intensity that neither of them had anticipated, not dramatic or chaotic, but thoughtful and deeply reflective, as if every small moment now carried extra meaning. The house felt different, warmer in some ways, calmer in others, and the tension that once lingered in corners had softened into something more honest. They moved through preparations together, not rushing, not pretending that love erased everything, but acknowledging that what they had faced had changed them both. She no longer avoided difficult conversations. When worry crept in, she named it, and he listened without immediately trying to fix it, learning that presence was sometimes more powerful than solutions. On evenings when fatigue settled in, they would sit quietly, sharing the kind of silence that no longer felt threatening, and in those moments he realized how far they had come from the night. He stood frozen on the stairs, listening to a truth that terrified him. The legal and financial matters reached their conclusion gradually, not with a dramatic victory, but with steady resolution. And when the final call was made and the last document signed, she cried in relief, not because everything was perfect, but because the weight she had carried alone was finally gone. He held her, understanding that this release was not just about money or fear, but about reclaiming a sense of self that had been eroded by secrecy. The nanny, ever observant, noticed the change as well, the lighter steps, the softer expressions, and though she remained in the background, her role in their story lingered like a quiet echo. On the morning of the wedding, the sun rose clear and bright, and as he dressed, he felt a calm certainty that surprised him, not the nervous excitement he had expected, but a grounded confidence born of shared struggle. He thought about vows not as poetic words, but as promises shaped by experience. Promises to listen even when silence would be easier, to speak even when fear suggested otherwise. When he saw her before the ceremony, there was no trace of the guarded woman from weeks before. She looked at him openly, vulnerability no longer hidden, and in that gaze he saw trust fully returned, not because nothing had gone wrong, but because they had chosen to face what did. As she walked toward him, memories flickered through his mind. The nanny's hushed warning, the sound of her voice on the phone, the long nights of conversation, the difficult meeting that had shifted everything. And instead of fear, he felt gratitude, because those moments had led them here with eyes wide open. During the ceremony, their words were simple, sincere, and when they promised honesty, it was not an abstract idea but a lived commitment, one both of them understood deeply. The guests smiled, unaware of the journey beneath the surface, and as they exchanged rings, he felt the quiet weight of responsibility settle comfortably rather than heavily on his chest. The celebration that followed was filled with laughter, music, and the familiar chaos of family and friends. But amid it all, there were moments when they found each other's hands instinctively, grounding themselves in the knowledge of what they had overcome. Later, as the evening softened and the crowd thinned, they stepped outside for a breath of air, the night cool and calm, and she leaned against him, thanking him once more for listening, for not turning away when he could have. He replied that listening had changed him too, teaching him that love is not about controlling the narrative of a perfect life, but about accepting the unpredictable reality of another human being. As they returned inside, the nanny caught his eye from across the room, offering a gentle smile, and in that small exchange he felt a quiet acknowledgement of the role she had played, a reminder that sometimes guidance comes in the softest voices. When the day finally ended and they were alone, exhaustion mixed with peace, and lying together in the quiet, he reflected on how a single whispered sentence had reshaped their future. What began as fear had become understanding. What began as secrecy had become trust. And in that transformation, he recognized the true beginning of their marriage, not marked by ceremony, but by the moment they chose to listen to each other fully and without fear.